a lot of these so-called pagans with their often so-called paganism, it's just a mask over their Christian beliefs. They're still Christian at their core. They just put a different mask. They don't realize it, they don't admit to it. But essentially, they're doing the same thing with a different name.
Yes. And that's kind of where Gnosticism comes in.
Exactly. And to understand all that, we have to go back to Gnosticism, which is part of your life's work.
And if you think about early Christianity, I'm talking beginning, square one, before the Gospels, during the Gospels, and right after the Gospels. So we have the histories that we get from the church talking about these heresies. And these heresies go back to Simon Magus, who lived in the time of Paul and Peter, or I should say, according to the book of Acts. So this is going back to before there was any like Christian church. These were just Jews and Samaritans, and people call themselves Magus. This was part of the tradition. Jesus is performing miracles. He's healing. That's what a Magus would do. He kind of was a Magus himself. Some books I've written on this. Anyways, we find this early pre-church hundreds of sects. I was going to say dozens, but it might be over 100 different sects and denominations of Christians that are reported by Epiphanius, Hippolytus, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, and I can go on and name the Carpocratians, the Simonians, the Valentinians, the Sethians, the Naassenes. I can just go on and on. And the thing about them all, they are all completely different from each other.
Yet they all believe they're Christian.
Yeah, and we call themselves Gnostics now. Some of them might have called themselves Gnostic. I think the Naassenes actually said, we are no.
I think what happened there is a little bit what happened through the works of Plato. Through Plato, we make a big distinction between the philosopher, exemplified by Socrates, and the sophists, who are like these second-rate, they do it for the money, they have dubious morals, and the philosopher is like, on his way to ascend to the gods.
Yeah.
Back in the day, there was no distinction. There were these people who had a method of thinking about the world and had just recently transferred it to thinking about political and moral affairs. They took a method that was meant to understand the revolution of the planets, and they turned it to understanding social affairs. That's what Socrates... The distinction between Socrates and someone like Pythagoras was not clear to your average Athenian.
Exactly.
For Plato, it's like you can cut it with a knife. There's the first-rate and second-rate thinker. But Pythagoras and others were first-class thinkers who are now overshadowed by the figure of Socrates because of a specific choice made by Plato.
By putting him in the dialogues.
Likewise, if you were to go back, now, because history is written by the winners, and in the case of the Bible, you have a very specific line of thinking that persevered.
It becomes Orthodox.
And
that's what I was getting at, is that these groups that we now call Gnostics were all completely different. They were unified by some loose things that bring them together.
Something?
And the Valentinians were Pythagoreans, for example.
Exactly.
But they're also Christians. They also read the Gospel of John. That was their central text. Some of these groups only had one Gospel central to them. Some of them had none of the four Gospels central to them, but read other weird Gospels. But the point I'm making is, today, in this new theosophy, new age world, it's sort of like that again. We have all these different groups. Some of them are on the internet. Some of them are local on the ground. You might go to England and find, some Norse pagans over there. And they're all very different from each other, but they're all sort of yearning for something similar of each other.
Exactly.
And it's sort of like that Gnostic age is back.
Exactly. This is where I want to focus. Because there was something that, like for an Orthodox Christian, all these other groups that you mentioned, the Sethians, the Carpocratians, were abominations, right? A lot of them had a sexual morality that was more liberal.
According to the later.
But
I will say this, though. I want to say it because some of these groups, you're right, were probably looked at bad in a negative way while they were around. I would say the Cainites, for example, they were very extremist. They were calling the God of the Old Testament the devil, basically. They're saying Cain was good, Abel was bad. those groups, okay, we can all look at that and go, they probably were looked at in a negative way. But other groups like Carpocratians or Valentinians, Valentinus was in Rome in the 140s and was this close to becoming the Pontifex Maximus, which he would have been on our list of popes today. Marcion was another one of these figures who was high up in the church. His father was Philologus, who was one of the 70 disciples mentioned in Luke Acts. That's Marcion's father. So while they're alive, they're part of the church. Later on, they look back and go, heretic.
I think the best metaphor, and I took it from Nixie's second book, which talks, I think it's called The Other Sons of God, which talks about all these Christian sects at the early. And she says, when we read the early centuries of Christianity, it's like watching a race, knowing the result. You know, we know that, and I think we had this discussion privately where, you know, if you watch Muhammad Ali, George Foreman rumble in the jungle, you know who wins. So everything looks like it's leading up to the victory. You know, like Muhammad Ali, he looks tired, he looks beaten, but you know, it's just a strategy to make the other fighter tired. When this fight was happening, it was that close.
Anyone could have won.
Anyone could have won. In retrospect, it all looks like it couldn't have been any other way.
Think about Valentinus winning the election.
Exactly.
He might have done things in power to change the direction of the church.
Exactly. So now, you look all these other heresies, you say, of course
they're wrong.
Like drinking snake venom and thinking that Jesus was actually the snake in the Garden of Eden. I think the Sethians.
But then you look at John's gospel and Jesus says, you will have power to drink snake venom and stand on scorpions.
Exactly.
So they're not, they have reasons for this stuff.
Exist. But now, because our mind is so conditioned by the people who actually won, who are the Orthodox Christians, and they look down upon all these heresies, and they will twist and turn some elements and make them even more exaggerated. We never hear their version of the story. And
we only have one side of the story. That's very important for us to mention.
Why would anyone make the connection between Jesus and the snake in the Garden of Eden? It sounds absurd to an Orthodox formed mind.
But then you read John and it says, the serpent was lifted up in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man also be lifted up. And then you go, that does sound like someone can pull some theology from that.
Exactly. So let's go back to when the battle was being raged, when Muhammad Ali was up in the ropes.
It's my favorite time of history, by the way.
So. I have found that understanding Gnosticism is the key to understanding what was happening in this era that gave birth to the modern world in some way. So, you know, take the lead, introduce us to, if someone was to ask you for a primer, Gnosticism 101, what is it? Why should we care about it?
I would start by saying this. Today we look at Mormons and Catholics, or here in Greece, Orthodox Christians, as completely opposites. The Mormons have different textbooks. They have the Book of Mormon. They have different prophets, Joseph Smith. They even think of God as not really the Trinity. They're not Trinitarians, they're Unitarians. They have all these different doctrines. But Mormons and Catholics or Orthodox are united on the major aspects of Christianity. They believe Jesus rose from the dead and is now God. They believe that. However, you would think that those divisions that I talked about, how separate, how different a Mormon is of a Catholic, is because of a long difference in time, and this church went in that direction, that church went in that direction, and over time you have all these thousands of sects and denominations: Baptist, Evangelical, Lutheran, Anglican. I can go on and on. I mean, all these different groups, but they all have different differences, of course, but they have more in common today than the earliest Christians had in common. Take any early Christian group. Look at the Valentinians. They were doing some weird Pythagorean gematria stuff. They had different triads than the Carpocratians, who said that you can become God, or God-like. You can become apotheosis. They did a deification of a man named Epiphanes in 117 AD on the island of Kephallonia. That is completely different from each other.
Yeah.
So the earliest Christians...
That is heresy in the modern sense.
It is now, but at the time, this was just Christianity. So the earliest Christians from the late 1st, early 2nd century were farther apart from each other than Christians are today. And we think Christians today are so far apart from each other, and they're actually not. So you would think the closer to Jesus, the more in line everyone's going to be, because you're going to the source. It's the opposite. The farther back in time you go, the closer you get to Jesus, the more different all these Christians become. It's the exact opposite of what you would think.
Which is the opposite of what you think. Because the story that we've been fed is that there was Jesus, there was his teachings, people heard it.
Yep.
And then
Peter, Paul, James.
And then some people just corrupted it.
Yeah, you have Peter, Paul, James, and they deliver the messages to these churches. And then it gets different over time. But it's actually the opposite.
Exactly. You think it's like a big bang. Like
it's a big bang, exactly.
But it's an opposite big bang, where the closer you go to the source, the more diverse
it gets. And I can even give you some examples. You have the Carpocratians, as I pointed out, who had this doctrine of apotheosis, where they look at Jesus not as necessarily the only person who's the Son of God, and he's the only person who was chosen to have the mind of God, the nous, as the Valentinians would say. No, they said, if you have gnosis and you train your brain to think like God thinks, then you become begotten by God. And that's why the Carpocratians had a doctrine that they only read John, first of all. And in John's gospel, there's no birth scene. Why is that? Luke has a birth scene. Matthew has a birth scene. John does not have a birth. Jesus is born when he's baptized in John. There's talk about the Carpocratians doing their baptism was their biggest ritual, right?
And the Gospel of John is the only gospel.
That's the only gospel that was central to them.
Because that's the only gospel that Jesus mentioned him as being God.
Yes, but they thought because of his baptism, he became begotten and he attained gnosis, apotheosis. So they taught that anyone can do this. They even said, according to the sources, Pythagoras became divine. They had statues of Pythagoras. Socrates became divine. Plato became divine. There's a few figures from ancient Greece that in their minds became divine. But they had images of Jesus, images of Mary, images of Pythagoras. And these are people in ancient history who they said attained apotheosis, and you can too.
So there were versions of Christianity that would fulfill this yearning of a national unity for Greeks much better than Orthodox Christianity. There were versions of Christianity that would look upon this ancient as not just their crude predecessors, but as actually almost equal.
So you had the prophets on one side.
To Jesus.
The prophets on one side in the Old Testament, Isaiah, Micah, Hosea, and they're all pointing to Jesus. But there's these early Christian groups from in all these cities like Ephesus and here in Athens and Philippi and Corinth, who are saying, well, yeah, the prophets, they pointed to Jesus, but our philosophers were paving the way, this sort of attitude of what would be like, what Christianity would come and fulfill us. And so you get sort of a marriage between the Greek and the Hebrew, in that Marcion was one of these proponents of, well, the Old Testament God was some other divinity. The real Father of God was this perfect God that Plato, the Platonic God.
This is where I want to get. So you have all these different versions of Christianity that we are talking about now as being as authoritative, despite what Orthodox Christianity would like us to believe. We understand that, these were people that heard the message from someone who heard the message from Jesus.
Yeah.
They were that close. They were 1, 2...
Even Justin Martyr.
Yeah, 1, 2, 3 links away
they're very close,
from Jesus.
And even Justin Martyr, who's living around 150.
And yet they're convinced that Jesus was the snake in the Garden of Eden.
Some of them.
They're convinced
very important
that Pythagoras was divine and Plato achieved divinity.
But it's very important to people to understand. when we talk about specific doctrines, like the snake one, that's a Sethian doctrine. That's the Sethians believed that. The Valentinians didn't believe Jesus was the snake. The Naassenes did believe he was the Naassenes were the snake handling one. Certain groups did, certain groups didn't. They all had their own doctrines.
Yeah.
But I wanted to point this out. Justin Martyr lived in around 150. He also held to this idea that the Greeks and the philosophers were divinely inspired and sort of leading towards the birth of Christianity. And then all the way to Eusebius, who wrote a text in the 4th century called Preparation for the Gospel, Preparatio Evangelica, where in that text, he's going, okay, we know that the Old Testament is prophesying Jesus. We know Moses talked about Jesus. But let me tell you about Pythagoras and how he prophesied Jesus. Let me tell you about Zoroaster and how he prophesied Jesus. This is in the 4th century. This is post the Nicene Creed. And these ideas are still there. They're still going. Yeah, the Greeks were great and they were part of our tradition.
So even then, the Christian doctrine had not fully crystallized into what
so some
it
of
was
these
still
remnants,
fluid. It was still fluid.
I'll even argue that the Trinity has some aspects in some of the early Gnostic groups, the Valentinians, who I mentioned. When the Valentinians were around, there was no Trinity yet. There was the Valentinians whose central book to them was John's Gospel. They didn't read any other Gospels but John. John was big for a lot of these Gnostics for whatever reason. Probably because it's got the logos, it's very Greek, it's got the true vine, it has some Dionysian aspects. Anyways.
It has a poetic
It's very poetic. You can see why the Greeks like John.
Yeah.
But Valentinians, we're looking at John 1 in particular, where in Greek it says Theos is the logos, and the logos was with God. And this logos was the light. In him was life, Zoe, and this Zoe was the Phos, the light of the world, and the truth, Aletheia. And then you read the Valentinian sources, and they are making a triad out of that: logos, Zoe, Theos. Theos is the Father of God, the mind, the nous, like Zeus. Jesus Christ is the logos, as it points out. But then you have this other aspect of Jesus called the life, Zoe. It's retelling Genesis. In the Septuagint, Genesis, the woman that comes from Adam's rib is called Zoe. It's a dyad. So you can see that a proto-Trinity in the Valentinian sources. Now, Orthodox people were saying, no, the Valentinians didn't give us that. They were heretics. Well, the triad was heretical according to Irenaeus. Irenaeus was not a Trinitarian. Hippolytus also says that the triad, which, by the way, the word in Greek for Trinity is triados. It's the same word. There's not one word for triad and one word for Trinity. They're calling this a Trinity. This was heretical in the 2nd century.
Because it reminded of paganism.
It was from the Valentinians.
It reminded of many gods.
Exactly.
You're breaking God apart
and then
many.
To top it all off, let's fast forward to the 4th century when the Trinity does get accepted and they do make a council of Nicaea and say everyone needs to believe this Trinity. The proponents against the Trinity, the Arians, Arius himself, called them Valentinians. He goes, you guys are a bunch of Valentinian heretics for believing in the Trinity.
And yet their belief is now the Orthodox belief.
That's the Orthodox. So he's literally calling them Valentinians for believing in the Trinity. Meanwhile, they're going, no, we believe this now. And they look back at the Valentinians and go, they were heretics.